Consumed by nostalgia. 1. Philosophy is essentially homesickness, the urge to be everywhere at home. This fragment, a single gesture of thought toward an object, is equally about philosophy and about nostalgia. If philosophy is the loss of self, the very memento of loss, which it was for Novalis, then so is the way home. If our struggles abroad, our self-preservation and self-discovery solidify our self, or multiply it as they did Odysseus's, then our homecoming is a flight into fluidity, or else a shedding of selves. We should arrive vulnerable, not ourselves, as if never having been exposed to the tempest of the elements or confronted with alterity. The self is a journey homeward, the homely return ever beyond the horizon. The transformations to nostalgic experience over the last century, particularly in the wake of 2 world wars, tell a dramatically different story. As the effective landscape and everyday life of Western culture were being reshaped, nostalgia, that erstwhile fulcrum of philosophy, began to change course, increasingly bound to the flow of capital. With the emergence of consumerism, utopias of newness, and dictatorships of speed, nostalgia, as it once was, became a reactionary vice and risked obsolescence. Capitalism, however, saw nostalgia's potential for profit and, channeling it now into its waters, gave it unprecedented currency. We face questions about a belatedly new, late-modern nostalgia, questions we nonetheless still struggle to formulate. With affect bound for world capital, is nostalgia the last intervening station? How was this itinerary conceived? When did we depart? And can we turn back if we have nearly arrived at our destination? 2. The confluence of nostalgia and capitalism infects as it affects. Historicists' delights and privations determine the price of longing for the past and continually expand the possibilities of its manufacture. Nostalgic fulfillment, no matter how elaborate, is by design provisional, since unfulfillment, the addiction behind the addiction, becomes infinitely more desirable. I consume out of curiosity, boredom, or envy, and it is how I consume that, as if by chance, consumes me by opening onto a new lack, expressed as nostalgia for a past gratuitously laid bare or gestured at. The pined-for past holds out against our desirous inroads. It is this ineluctable logic so vital to nostalgia that capitalist praxis perverts. Nostalgia reproduces rapidly through the channels of symbolic economy, the opportunities that accompany consumer capitalism, to construct our identity by sharing or giving access to personal history, representing some significant, privileged, living connection with the past, in case the link corrodes or the chain linking the past in collective memory loses its hold on the imagination. These same opportunities excoriate the remembrance, and with it the things remembered, their autonomous life in our memory, beyond any justification and benefit. The more we are strip-mined for our past, coaxed out of circumspection, and led to articulate our experiences, the lesser, generally speaking, becomes our intimacy with what we lived and witnessed. On the one hand, this process is culturally responsible. Depositing one's memories into the archive of culture seems the only way of preserving them from time's ravages and sure oblivion. From the naive point of view of cultural sustainability, individual memory can change hands, with the sum knowledge of the past not merely undepleted, but enriched. Yet, the most intimate relationship with the past can be overwritten by abstract memories. We have learned from books that memory is a palimpsest, and that only such intimacy, even a modicum of it, can make the submerged meaning legible. Gradual estrangement from our memories suggests we are losing the art of decipherment. Likewise, Excessive nostalgia affords us the means to ignore the radically unfamiliar and turn away from blank, unclaimed futures. If the public commemoration of bygone events makes us work for their restitution, if we cling to the recent past and put it on record, and if we have begun to speak of nostalgia for the present, it is because there seems no breaking the nostalgic chain forged in capital. With the exhaustion of first-hand experience, second-hand memory comes to serve nostalgia as well, if not better, redoubling our longing for the first-hand. The more we indulge in our feeling for good old anachronisms, the more sentimentally we look back at our life, the cheaper our nostalgia is to evoke and the costlier it is to appease. Before long, we have pawned the better share of our past, our nostalgia subsisting on borrowed memories. Subtending this economic model is the commodification of affective memories that constitute nostalgia and nostalgia-driven activity. To capitalize on nostalgia is to profit from the sale of such memories on the premise that they are reproducible and transferable, and, in ideological terms, that emotions, no matter how manipulated, retain their naturalness and remain a counterweight to materialism. Ultimately, however, capitalized nostalgia costs us part of our ability to bear the weight of private memory, that is, memory that is alive not in spite but because of its solitude. It puts into question the value of lived experience, whose reproduction, patented and marketed as authentic, becomes itself nostalgiogenic. Such recreated past has little staying power. The gratification it provides is devised as expendable, given up for another past on offer. Commodified nostalgia is, predictably, self-consuming nostalgia. One corollary of the hollowed-out relationship with the past engendered by this process is the welcome reproduction of various pasts down to the smallest detail. The logic of nostalgia dictates that nothing can really be recovered, only recollected, reimagined. But nostalgia, collaborating with capitalism, has this message to convey. With a little ingenuity and investment, we, as a society of individualists, can regain desired aspects of the past. Such verisimilitude rejects the historical integrity of the original. What was strange transitions as exotic or quaint toward assimilation into the superficially familiar. The more distant a past, the better it can serve as a playground for the commercially bound imagination. If, as a result, we come to regard the ancients as our contemporaries, it is because what once lay largely in the purview of aesthetic experience, historical or literary study, has become more readily accessible through forms of mass media entertainment and the cost and time-effective heritage industry. Mass production and consumption exhausts the past by paring down its heterogeneity for effortless recognition and streamlined exhibition. Whatever the past redivivus, it is valuable insofar as it confirms us in our current existence. It is fortuitously dropped from the historical repertoire when its image becomes dehistoricized through overexposure and association with the here and now. Its nostalgic potential, utilized in this way, is thus attenuated. Only after an interval of commercial death or lying low in the hierarchy of market value can we expect its recrudescence. When it reappears with the vividness of near non-recognition, as if from the deep end of the unconscious. For it is not a cliché that one buries the past, but a quintessential statement on the past framed by individual existence. The flood of nostalgia marketing finds another limit in instinctual self-preservation. Manufactured nostalgias do not command our dreams. Despite the artist's proverbial aversion and resistance to consumerism, capital lays claim to the artistic past in tandem with the artistic present. This is a simple matter of manipulating cultural perspective. Nostalgia is discovered at the root of every avant-garde. The present state of art is attributed to declining aesthetic standards. Critics reward the return to classical technique, and art is proclaimed as a thing of the past. Similar rhetoric is applied to things commercial and or practical in purpose, which often gain artistic value in the process. As Claude Lévi-Strauss observed in New York in the 1940s, one surrounds oneself with these objects not because they are beautiful, but because, since beauty has become inaccessible to all but the very rich, they offer, in its place, a sacred character. It is important to think through the reversal of fortune that this entails. What was commercial and everyday may, with the passage of time, become sublated, consumed, its nostalgic charge spent. It is retired from mass culture, emancipated from the cycle of economic exchange, and given a shimmering afterlife, until we come across it, not knowing what to make of something so forgotten and so arresting. Their decommissioning is an occasion for things even artificial or utilitarian to begin with, things outmoded or broken, effaced and worn out, to redeem themselves through time. An occasion capitalism disavows but cannot prevent. 3. Nostalgia, in its uncompromised form, may romanticize its object, but this romanticization is not synonymous with physical comfort, psychological security, moral hygiene, beauty, and contentment. Freud saw the house as a symbol of quiescence, of being unborn, a substitute for the womb, one's first dwelling, probably still longed for, where one was safe and felt so comfortable. Yet nostalgia is not a longing to return to this safe home, but to home as a scene of incubation, a singular knot of unmade decisions, of excitement at the flowering of alternatives, of reversible mistakes, of preparations for departure. Thus, the past is reimagined along with that past's uncertainty about the future, as well as the thrill arising from that precariousness and from the relative remoteness of death, then relative to now, and now relative to then. A past exerts a pull on us because it is an open door to real and imagined possibilities. Or, in the case of a past we either were not alive or have not lived to see, to historical realia that to us nonetheless signify the unexplored and that have since become defunct. Nostalgia involves, then, a departure from the definite past for the indefinite. Its footfalls echo in the memory, down the passage which we did not take, towards the door we never opened, into the rose garden. T.S. Eliot, Burnt Norton. We long to forsake the actual past as our memory swells with apparent missed opportunities. At its extreme, nostalgia is a revolt against the past as fait accompli, against the past's facticity. As a recourse to what has passed away, it defies mortality and foreclosure of the possible futures it brings. Its epigraph, "Only through time, time is conquered." Because nostalgia is often spurred by regret, it illuminates the margins of what came to pass. Its manipulative use of the past consists in excavating and multiplying potentialities obscured in the course of time. By the same token, however, nostalgia itself can be easily manipulated and exploited. Feelings of irreversible loss, for some precise, for others quite nebulous, that accompany regret, and, fundamentally, a sense of the pastness of the past, are assuaged by the consumption of products reminiscent of that past, its selective semblances, and of nostalgia as such. Nostalgia marketing does not merely give a new lease on life to our dormant emotive attachments to the past. It tries to transpose the more resonant associations onto new commodities. Meanwhile, services and disposable goods multiply, and our material attachments become more cursory, more ephemeral. The ideal domain of capital research and investment is everyday life, since, as Blanchot observed, the everyday impugns all values and the very idea of value, disproving always anew the unjustifiable difference between authenticity and inauthenticity. Devoid of responsibility for values, daily life remarks only the worth of commodities, the necessity of clock time, of pseudo-cyclicality, of routine, of the expenditure and renewal of energy, and the relative freedom of leisure to consume. It is no coincidence that everydayness, as trivial as it is tireless, invites the fabrication of nostalgia, ignoring the breach of authenticity and dispensing with truth about the past. Within its repetitious spontaneity, anomie, private uneventfulness, and ambiguous temporality, nostalgic daydreams point up the obliqueness of time itself, as nostalgic consumption does the ambiguity of the event. Nostalgia alleviates tedium not actively, through dialectical recovery, but by juxtaposition, taking the mind off of what some see as nostalgia's prerequisite, the tedium that does not allow itself to be forgotten. Yet because the vicissitudes of the everyday have the power to stir in us a dread of nihilism, challenging us to overcome it, they leave open the possibility of dialectical recognition and auto-critique. The deepening of nostalgic experience lies in the negative dialectical movement of its reverie, in the crisis of self, and finally in the quickening of another reality. Those remarking on the mediation of past experience, historical objects or sites, often make use of a conceptual shorthand, commodification of the past, to refer to what, in fact, is the peddling of affective attachments to the past. As a commodity and mass marketing device, nostalgia draws on the reserve of historical contents, whose representations are its condition of existence. Nostalgia can be a hidden surcharge for heightening a product's desirability. We pay for nostalgia directly where the product itself is an affective experience of a recovered, restaged, reenactive, relived past. Even in situations where authentic objects are used to elicit the desired consumer response, the context of exchange, its potential repetition, and its technical mediation drain these objects' nostalgic resources. Our difference to them coincides with their loss of marketing potency. The mediation of nostalgia through reproduction, artistic or mechanical, is of course nothing new. Today's technological mediation, however, differs in commercial scale and operates within a multi-tier marketing strategy. The paramount historical role of photography in the production and marketability of nostalgia should not go unremarked. From the mid-19th century, notes Walter Benjamin, this new medium greatly extended the sphere of commodity exchange by flooding the market with countless images of figures, landscapes, and events which had previously been available either not at all or only as pictures for individual customers. Paris, the capital of the 19th century. It was not long before the utility of mass visual reproduction became harnessed to documentation and the expansion of archiving institutions. Photography's influence grew apace with the need to record privately and for posterity in what was fast becoming the memory industry. The immediacy and accuracy of relations between the photograph and visual reality compensated with authenticity, or so it seemed at first, for what this mechanical medium lost in artistry to painting. Photographs increasingly preserve not just images of the present, but also of artifacts and loci of near and remote pasts. These were becoming collectively recognizable in an expanding mass market culture. Many, in fact, came to epitomize the era they referenced for a growing number of consumers. The mass market soon began to capitalize on the association stimulated by old photographs and to use them to sell both modern merchandise and replicas of sought-after relics. Nostalgia's current visibility owes its existence to the photograph. Once, however, they have spent their commercial charge, historical contents cease, at least for a time, to circulate like well-behaved commodities. Despite being unchained from capital, their time of compliance has taken its toll. Their dignity is violated, yet they have broken no code. The waning of their efficacy indicates that they have been demoted, divested of value, abandoned for good. Such, anyhow, is the hypnotized perception of the modern consumer, an after-image of consumption's irrationality and competitiveness, the search for lower prices or more rarefied products. For these reasons, only through an extended mass-market absence can the authenticity of historical contents be recuperated. A thing that has, for all intents and purposes, left the circuit of exchange exists casually, at the mercy of chance encounters with strangers. If it is buried, all the better for it. A longer period of convalescence may deliver it from the perils of time and misrecognition when it finally reappears. The diagnosis of nostalgia's perversion thus implies a cure. The most far-fetched inference to be drawn from the status quo is that time will end up entirely consumed by nostalgia, that the present, or what used to pass for it, will be construed as past and as object of longing, and that this literal nostalgia for the present will lead, through a perpetual regress of self-alienation, to total bankruptcy. In reality, the capitalist transvaluation of nostalgia leads, circuitously, via the vagaries of exuberance, to effective renewal. We can ferry it into the present, we can simulate it, we can lose all veneration for it, but after some respite, and unless we destroy all its traces, the past will out. To predict this is to invest myself in nostalgia's future, by way of cultivating nostalgia for a particular kind of nostalgia. To then deny my sympathy for Peter Fritzsche's fearful vision would be a dubious about face. I am referring to the mutant, persistently discontinuous nostalgia without melancholy, which, in light of the radically nostalgic legacy of the 19th century, can hardly be seen as nostalgia in the proper, melancholic sense. Even so, Fritzsche's apparent identification of nostalgia with the melancholy of history raises questions of historical development. More pertinently still, one wonders which of Fritzsche's two types, phases of nostalgia, the one with or the one without melancholy, is the continuity, and which the interruption. Despite acknowledging nostalgia's historical contingency, Fritzsche appears wary of its conceptual displacement, his sights set on a narrowing horizon. It is no longer a matter of envisioning and bracing for the new nostalgia. A preponderance for the evidence proves that nostalgia's meaning has already shifted. For some, this new nostalgia is only another transition. For others, it expands nostalgia's experiential field. For still others, it marks the end of the past's phenomenological significance. Although we cannot revert to the old nostalgia, these grimmer pronouncements and valorizations, are they not the platform of its custodians? Do private collectors of antiques and of old things in general also preserve the traditional nostalgia? An antique collection may begin as an expression of nostalgia, removed from value considerations, but no serious collector can long refrain from systematic attention to the business of collecting. The inevitable plan for the acquisition of objects in assembling a collection is likely to transmute one's motivation from a desire for direct contemplation of one's possessions to a desire for their accumulation and exclusive possession, along with the social status attached to having a personal mooring back in history. Baudrillard, The System of Objects. A collection only opens up to deep nostalgic experience when its items, mythic reference to the past, is not taken for granted. Or perhaps, even farther still, back to a pre-birth reality where pure subjectivity was free to conflate itself metaphorically with its surroundings, and where desire, not yet in conflict with reason, structured the acquisition of knowledge. Collectors whose passion exceeds their capital would seem to have some advantage in this regard, according more mythic value to their precious possessions. Indeed, the sense of ownership, rather than invariably corrupting one's sensitivity, may become ground for a profound intimacy, especially when one's property is rare. Benjamin offers a personal example of this in Unpacking My Library. The cultural functionality of collected objects, as signs of the past, remains intact even in a sequestered collection. Their removal from the market is merely physical. They continue to circulate and signify in duplicates, replicas, and catalogue images. Lest collectors pride themselves on saving things from misrecognition or the mass market, the question of value must be at the back of their mind if the objects are to retain their historical gravity and nostalgic allure. A form of liberation more radical than the antique collector's, whose effectiveness is directly proportional to his or her purchasing power, would be one that does not rely on the object's rareness or prior discharge from uselessness, but, on the contrary, on its market overuse and oversupply, without relative or objective diminishment of its qualities. Such hypothetical liberation could hardly be sanctioned and regulated by the manufacturer. Yet it is a fact that, without the aid of human charity, and quite despite itself, Capitalism periodically rehabilitates the past as such, not merely for individual, but for whole classes of objects. This apology of capitalism is nothing if not backhanded. Can I be sure about the long-term effects of the all-pervasive nostalgification of the past? The virtuality and hyperreality of the global simulacrum, the spectacle of the eternal present, their coming may only be a matter of time. It is not here yet, but the future is in one sense already current. You could meet its harbingers in the street. My awareness of this makes my prognosis tenuous, and my choice to focus, for the nonce, on capitalist economy's redeeming qualities seems an ambivalent one. Will the future be able to re-enter the historical dimension? Will it restore particular meanings to forgotten objects upon its encounter with them, in recognition of their full and continued existence? Ironically, it is when we fail to recognize it, and our failure deprives this moment of its epiphanic through-line, that the extant foreign thing regains its provenance and becomes present to us, not as a reification of the past, not through some symbolic representation and marketing optics, not as signal or fetish, but as apparition and remainder, by way of contiguities with other times and places. In the instant of its apprehension, it functions as an index of time in letting our reflection pass through it, because the first question we would ask of this half-lit other is, where has it come from? Perhaps our vestigial historical sense would frame the question differently. Where has all this gone? No matter, because the thing stays exactly where it is, mute until summoned, until some research into its former circumstances, its fate, its historical truth, is undertaken and bids it speak. This next step, toward the rapport or toward historical dialectic, is precisely where the nostalgist and the futurist part ways. 4. Philosophers of progressive history, and especially advocates of endism, tend to turn a blind eye on past suffering qua history. Typically, and paradoxically, history lies for them in futurity. These thinkers uphold the Hegelian contention that the wounds of history heal without leaving scars. The manufacture of nostalgia is in line with this utopian telos. On the production line of positive pasts, there is little danger of scarring. Scar tissue, it turns out, is just another candidate, like the wrinkle in time and the age spot, for dermal resurfacing. Soon, who will remember what a scar could reveal of Odysseus? Who will be able to tell one's age? We cannot long, sensu stricto, for such a sanitized, surgically enhanced past. Philosophers of that ilk posit the future as a static infinity. Progressive history advances across an endless expanse, its motion no longer relative. Hence the static notion of futurity typical of such philosophies, which is no proof of the limits of human imagination, only those of human fear and desire. Nostalgia, as the longing for a specific past, would naturally seem to be its reverse, projecting back a finite and dynamic world unconstrained by present worries or wants. The past, if it is to retain its hold on imagination and remembrance, so that we can feel heir not only to the Greeks and Romans, but to near infinity, Z. Herbert, must, however, be configured not as a finitude, which can in theory be encompassed by cultural, biological memory, but as an infinitude of infinitely divisible events. The further back, the more diluted the past appears, before vanishing altogether in the mythical dawn of being, when the human eye, still blind, was no implement of desire. The painful realization of nearly lost continuity with archaic time leads us to form attachments to it that are affective, metaphysical, and archival. By comparison, our ties to the future are primarily organic, ethical, pragmatic, and scientific. In contrast to the past, we have no new poetics of the future. The sacred plenitude of being, unity in multiplicity, absence of time, despite our skepticism toward the metaphysical or the merely empirical, They appear to us as phylogenetically realistic. If the present is time tightly wound, anamnesis is an indeterminate unwinding of time. Let the past assume the shape of a funnel, on the wider end an originary ontic fullness, of which the tapered end, the present, is an adumbration. Naturally, the visions projected onto the past are always closer to such a plenum than is the present, while our apprehensions about the future transform the latter into a vanishing point or vacuum. This notion, crucial to experiencing nostalgia's spiritual dimension, has at least some epistemic basis. The further back we look, the softer our focus, the more diluted and permeable time appears. The sharper then becomes our speculation, the freer, more allegorical our imagination, on whose peripheries the sacred is at home. Commodified nostalgia does away with an infinite mythopoeic past. It divides the past into a finite series of static tableaux arranged in accordance with accredited chronologies. The shallow longing that increasingly ousts deep commitment to remembrance denies a past any parturiency in its own right, emotional, spiritual, physical, and accepts its truth insofar as it links or links up with a valid chain of events and historical high points. It would seem that, though in conflict and without parity, the two economies of nostalgia, the superficial and the profound, can coexist. In all probability, however, as happened to ancestral lines in our evolutionary past, the more robust strain will eventually drive the weaker to extinction. Modern nostalgia is often described as a compensatory phenomenon, a reaction to the surfeit of forgetfulness, that is, to a sense that the present is undergoing an evacuation of meaning that is too rapid and too total. It was certainly coeval with a new experience of time that merged the world historicalness of progress with the compression of quotidian temporality. The far side of modernism matched subjective private time and nostalgic anamnesis, the spontaneous remembrance of one's past, against standard public time, sentimentalistic antiquarianism, and positivistic historicism. The contest between these modernist ideologies had two correlatives. On the one hand, anxiety and deracination, in light of an acute awareness that the past was linear and irretrievable, that time, closed to interpretation, also cannot be suspended. And, on the other hand, the sense of being historically anchored and of optimism about the future. The Industrial Revolution's effect on travel and communication offered a solution to this crisis in the shape of a collective secular fantasy, the time machine. What could be more symbolic of that momentous zeitgeist? But the fantasy of physical time travel, the pedantic elaboration of its premises, is incompatible with nostalgia. The former is concerned with the past as spectacle, subject to consumptive forays from the future, and as raw material, subject to the time surveyor's gaze, and ultimately to modification in fulfillment of the desire to master human destiny, thereby enhancing human survival in the future. Time travel is as egotistic and desecrative as nostalgia is ecstatic and consecratory in its relation to the past. Abetting capitalism's co-option of nostalgia was culture's increasingly uneasy attitude to its own historicity. Continuity with the past is maintained through material culture, and, owing to modern angst over historical amnesia and memory's fallibility, museology evolved to maintain it. For all the anti-dialectical, cool didacticism of systematized collections, the first public museums revolutionized nostalgia. They catalyzed the contemplation of the past in 19th century urban environments. Cataloging, restoring, and reproducing museal artifacts meant their enshrinement as heritage for public consumption. This involved directing, institutionalizing, and didacticizing nostalgic experience in the guise of lessons from history. One could say that, through no fault of their own, museums' proliferation sped up the process of the past's commodification, in response to the growing demand for the source, the hieratic repository of the original. If nostalgia is the longing for a potentiated past, redolent with possibilities imaginatively reactivated, It at the same time involves awareness of the constraints and frontiers of history and of their transgression. Through nostalgia, we are reminded of the longed-for past's uniqueness. We do not rush to reinsert it into the historical continuum, to run along the scale of dates without lingering at the sites of memory. Bachelard. Of course, a vigorous sense of history and individualism reclaim this past as weeds do once arable soil. It is the dissociation and tension between a consciousness of the past as such, the past as it has been, and the past as it might have been, that qualifies nostalgic soundings of memory, and that prevents us from surrendering to a totalitarian fantasy of rerouting the stream of history and erasing its scars, as facilitated by the convergence of nostalgia and consumerism. In ethical terms, the nostalgist benefits from self-sabotage. A nostalgic disposition is discernible in the configuration of philosophy as a mental journey home, where home stands for truth about the world, the absolute, and ourselves. Philosophical thinking of this kind, predicated on the principle of ontological change, was once the highest expression of nostalgic sentiment. Life without philosophy was one of vagrancy and errancy, of pleasures and illusions masking the self's divinity or absurdity, in either case occluding its happiness. Although Camus dismissed the idea that a man's thought is his nostalgia as spurious, nostalgia's spiritual dimension still lay within the bounds of lucid reason containing its limits. Nostalgia revealed itself as a lack that only the return to an elusive origin, not beyond existence, but somewhere within it, could eliminate. And, if we reason lucidly, that origin is at once everywhere and nowhere in particular. It is no longer possible for a Westerner to be displaced. Everywhere he finds himself at home. Agassinsky. Given our globalized economy, this point seems almost incontestable. Can Occidental tourists, business travelers, etc., today deny that they are everywhere hosted by their own reflections, in the form of familiar goods and services? One of the arrangements of global cosmo-capitalism is that, generally speaking, tourism is no longer the culturally uncomfortable experience it once was. The connotations of home are now overwhelmingly economic. By extension, the prevailing economy of the self is capitalistic. We have naturalized mobility as our manner of inhabiting the world, conditioned to develop little or no affinity for any one place, traveling light. Yet philosophical thinking opposes and complicates this free dwelling, moving in material security as inauthentic, even ironizes this authenticity, reminding us of the full meaning of roots. For us, moderns, home is always already in the past, and its attainment a futuristic image. Perspective is everything. Everything is perspective. Ernst Bloch cautioned against nostalgic excess thus: even what was should not hold us as such. Nothing past should be sought so faithfully that one goes back, truly back. One often dreams of it, but one should beware. The physical return can only mimic the impossible nostalgic return. Above all, reunion with an utterly vanished as well as splendid past has some of the self-pity that is revealed in the usual sentimentality of such moments. Only then does the worst catastrophe of all take shape, the completely airless space, the reunion with ruins, with nothing but what is sealed up within them, easily becomes a departure from oneself, as from someone who never became. A dead man has then returned. In truth, modern reunions, odysseys, and imitations of Homeric sensibility are awkward, conflicted, and unconvincing. What did a scar reveal of Odysseus? That in spite or because of his wandering curiosity, he had returned. A souvenir of his youth, no less illuminated for having occurred long ago, it was also the proof of his identification with that island, a mark of his nostalgia, deep yet plain to see. But where had he arrived? In a place 20 years thence, at first unrecognizable, though he and this once home, united at last, appeared essentially unchanged. On Ithaca, time has not stood still, measured by waiting, by deferral, by the winding and unwinding of memory. Neither did time stop for Odysseus. It was, rather, he, self-possessed and nostalgic, who stopped for time. The true return is to his preserved core, his former role of king and husband. Paradoxically, the mutual dissemblance of Odysseus and his native island when he first awakes on its shore is truthful. It manifests their mutual strangeness. When his core identity is finally discovered, it is an act of hospitality in which Odysseus remains both stranger and host. His undisguising is the end of his passage, in which he had not only to return, but also to prove himself the same Odysseus. In the tortuous voyage home, temptations uncovered to him the plurality of self. He has long longed to be true to himself. Yet had Odysseus been modern, he would have, in lieu of a disguise, so changed through his travels as to become almost unrecognizable, physically and morally a stranger in his own land, reminded of and never restored to himself in the ambiguity of his return. Would he not soon enough have cast himself out again, like Robinson Crusoe, not knowing what to call home, the bigger or the smaller of the two islands, perhaps, too, the sea? Crusoe shares with Odysseus a permanent core self, but it is characterized by profligacy, and he is returned to it almost involuntarily. What is bred in the bone will not go out of the flesh. Crusoe's ostensible, unconfirmed identity, the one with which he aligns himself, is that of prodigal son. Yet his labile, shifting sense of home causes his longing to be displaced and, in effect, never wholly satisfied. He revisits without returning, compelled to embark on new adventures. 5. The historical morphology of nostalgia reveals at least three modes of nostalgic experience based on distinct economic models. The one with which I have concerned myself here, capitalist nostalgia, issues from an economy of representations, simulating, retrieving, repossessing lost pasts, indeed lost temporalities. What can be called romantic nostalgia is, by contrast, rooted in an economy of representations, in which the past is experienced as irretrievable. Philosophical nostalgia, the sublation of romantic nostalgia into systematic thought, is predicated in turn on an economy of statements that makes the irretrievable past the precondition for insight. Plunging into the deep waters of nostalgia, we resensitize ourselves to the vertical dimension of past phenomena. This is where human existence can find its retreat, an asylum for its full potentiality, and where it most resembles myth. Romantic or philosophical nostalgia re-enchants and cuts both ways. It has the power to make the superficially familiar deeply strange, and the superficially strange deeply familiar. The difference between it and the capitalistic form lies in the mass appeal, the side effects, and the far lesser affective intensity of the latter. Consumerist nostalgia, while ostensibly tributary to empathy with the past and to the reinvention of one's identity, is aggregative. It expands and multiplies the self by staging encounters with and assimilating familiar, homogenized pasts. Romantic nostalgia, meanwhile, is a longing to survive oneself, to become other than one is. In the arithmetic of the self, it is subtraction. The poignancy of nostalgia in the modern world stems from a coincidence in it of excitement and suffering, salvation and self-sacrifice. The romantic diction of this conclusion need not be off-putting. Who better than the Romantics, Novalis at their helm, knew the poetry of alienation, and the perfect irony of yearning for meaning without language, for interiority without self?